That's not the first time that's happened, so it's a long one. Good afternoon. My name is Katie Spiglieri, and I'm a student at the Georgetown University Law Center, pursuing my master's in environmental and energy law. I'm also an institute associate at the Georgetown Climate Center, working with communities to prepare for the impacts of climate change. For over a decade, our Georgetown Climate Center has served as a leading resource for states and cities, helping them craft legal and policy solutions to curb climate emissions and to build resilience to the impacts of climate change, such as intense storms and increasing sea level rise. I am honored to introduce Congressman John Delaney, a fellow Georgetown alumnus. Congressman Delaney graduated from the Georgetown Law Center in 1988 with his JD. Shortly thereafter, he launched 2 separate business ventures where he became the youngest CEO to be featured on the New York Stock Exchange. In 2004, Congressman Delaney was named the Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year. Congressman Delaney represented Maryland's 6th Congressional District for 3 terms, where he served on the House Financial Services Committee and the Joint Economic Committee. Please join me in welcoming Representative John Delaney to the stage.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you so much.
How you doing, Congressman? Good to see you.
Reyes?
Have a seat.
It's great to be here.
So let's start where we've been starting with everyone, which is when and how did you come to appreciate the scale and the urgency and acuity of the challenge and threat posed by climate change?
Well, I would say that I probably started really focusing on it seriously about 10 or 15 years ago. And then when I had the privilege of serving in the Congress and was first elected in 2012, it really became part of my area of interest, because I thought I had a very unique perspective as someone who had been in the private sector and understands that you need solutions that actually change behavior fundamentally in the private sector to address this issue. So that was and then, you know, the thing that really sharpened my focus on it was the Keystone Pipeline, which is I was one of the first members of Congress to come out against the Keystone Pipeline. And that issue was brewing when I first arrived in Congress. And that really made me sit down and say, okay, let me get a view as to how I think about this issue globally and U.S. leadership on this issue. And it was from that moment I said to myself, I really have to put forth some real solutions on this issue.
So take me through the thinking on the Keystone Pipeline. Like, what about that forcing mechanism of having to decide where you stood on that? What was your thinking? What led you to come to the conclusion that you should oppose it?
Well, what led me most fundamentally to come to the conclusion I should oppose the Keystone Pipeline is the fact that it was a terrible symbol we were sending to the world. In other words, if the United States made this decision to actually build this pipeline, to bring the dirtiest possible oil to market, and potentially, you know, put ourselves in a position of decades and decades and decades of CO2 emissions coming from that deposit, which was largely landlocked otherwise, that we would have no credibility around the world. So it wasn't so much just about the calculus of how much CO2 that would put into the atmosphere, which was bad, and in and of itself justified not supporting it. But to me, it was a real question of U.S. leadership, which is obviously something we have none of right now with our president on this issue. But the United States couldn't credibly go around the world, which I think we have a responsibility on this issue. We could not credibly go around the world and say, we want to lead on this issue. We want to start changing behavior around the world because it is a global problem, when we just made a decision to unlock all of this previously largely trapped oil and bring it to market.
You've been running for president for a little while now, and you've been all over.
I thought I'd clear the field. I got to say, it's great to be here. You know, I'm a Georgetown alum.
I just learned that.
And a very, very proud Hoya. My wife is also a Hoya. We met at Georgetown. One of the many great things that happened to me at Georgetown. The best thing, actually. And I have two of my kids are Hoyas, including one of my daughters who's in the room here.
She better be in the room.
Who's a freshman, yeah. Oh, there she is. Yeah. So anyway, I had to give my Georgetown plug.
Yeah.
I'm so happy that you're doing this too. Good for you.
You've been going around, and I asked this to Senator Sanders that, you know, I'm curious just what you've heard on the campaign trail, what you've heard and what you've seen, and how that has fleshed out your sense of what the actual front edge of the effects of climate change are.
Well, I've spent a lot of time in Iowa, where people who run for president spend a lot of time in Iowa. I've actually done over 30 trips to Iowa. I've been to all 99 counties. And I've seen the effect firsthand with the agricultural communities that I've spent a ton of time with and the challenges they see coming from climate change. But also Iowa, particularly this last year, has had terrible floods. You know, because people think of the issues around sea levels as a coastal issue. But it's actually also a heartland issue because a lot of incredibly important rivers, you know, are central to the economic conditions of this country. And the floods that we saw in Iowa were homes 2 or 3 miles from the river. We're completely devastated, and I toured them. So this is an issue that is affecting people. And you know, the other thing about Iowa is in a rough place right now because of the trade war, right? Because we're currently in a trade war with China, which means China, that's the largest buyer of soybeans in the world, is not buying soybeans from the United States of America. And we were historically the largest seller of soybeans in the world. So the largest buyer of soybeans stopped buying from the largest seller. That has hurt farmers. But you know what else it did? Is it caused those fires in the Amazon. Because farmers around the world suddenly said to themselves, well, if the United States is not selling soybeans, maybe we can sell them to China. But in order to grow soybeans, we have to actually clear the forests. And so they set fires. And the reason I bring this up is it's kind of related to agriculture, and it's kind of related to trade. And we should be thinking about using the world's agricultural resources as efficiently as possible. Right? The ratio of the number of trees around the world and the amount of farmland is incredibly important for this issue. And if we engage in these pointless trade wars, we create a situation where the global agricultural food chain, for lack of a better term, is disrupted. And you get things like farmers burning forests to grow soybeans. So not only do you have farmers in Iowa that are hurt because of this trade war because their crop prices are less, but you have an incentive for people around the world to clear forests. So all this stuff is interconnected. And you appreciate that angle much more when you're actually spending a lot of time in a place that actually supplies a lot of the world's food.
When you do talk to farmers, and I know you've spent considerable time in Iowa, I wonder, does climate change as the sort of underlying cause come up from them? Like, do people volunteer that as a thing they're thinking about?
Some do, some don't. I mean, to be honest with you. A lot of farmers really care about it because they're actually observing changes in the condition, and particularly multi-generational family farms. You know, and actually, my wife April, her dad was a potato farmer in Idaho, not Iowa. People get those things confused sometimes when you're on the coast. And so we have a lot of perspective on these multi-generational family farms. And I think those people really have seen it because they've grown up around the farms. You know, it's very personal to them, the relationship they have with the land. And they see it. They see how much more difficult it is to access water. Yields, absent new technologies, would be down otherwise. You know, I'm not sure on the big corporate farms if it's that relevant,
right.
But on family farms, they get it.
So I want you to talk to me about your understanding of what the latest IPCC report and its timeline, what it means for what the kind of parameters of what the US and other countries need to do is.
So I think there's 3 things that are very clear from that report. The first is that we have to get to net zero emissions by 2050. Because unless we do that, the planet's likely to warm more than 2 degrees Celsius, and the implications of that are terrible. So the goal has to be very clear, which is get to net zero emissions by 2050. That's the first thing. The second thing that comes out of that report is we fundamentally need new innovation. We need new innovation in battery and transmission technologies. And this, to me, is a very important role of the United States of America. I envision, for example, Paris 2.0, which I'd like to implement as president, being a global cooperative around technology and innovation, where all of the leading countries of the world not only invest in, but contribute intellectual property and scientific capability, which again, the United States, which possesses the greatest universities in the world, I think is uniquely positioned to contribute to. We fundamentally have to build new technologies around battery and transmission if we actually ever want to get the world to net zero by 2050. We can do it here, but a lot of the developing world that is literally bringing billions of human beings into the middle class, which is a great thing, they also need energy. And unless we deliver technological solutions to these countries, they're going to deliver energy through fossil fuels. So that's the second thing, that we need a lot of innovation. And the third thing is that we actually have to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. I believe that to get to net zero by 2050, we actually have to remove 20% of the CO2 that exists in the atmosphere. And so what that tells me, and one of the things I've called for as president, is to invest in direct air capture technologies. CO2 vacuums that actually will remove CO2. So those are the three conclusions I get from that report. We're running out of time. What matters is how quickly we start acting on these things. We have to have a net zero by 2050 target. We have to lead the world in innovation. And we also have to develop global, scalable CO2 removal technologies.
On that last thing, that's an area of some controversy, right? Because that is not, at this point, is not market ready. We don't have anything scalable.
The technologies work.
The technologies work.
Yeah.
They're quite far
yes.
on the current timeline from being scalable in any sense. What do you imagine the investment in that looks like to get that to something that could be?
So this is what I would do. Because if we were sitting here 30 years ago, Chris, we would have said the same thing about wind and solar. We would have said the technologies work, but they're not scalable. But what did we do? We created a market using tax credits, and we've largely invented the renewable market, and prices have come way down to the point where it's less expensive than fossil fuels. That's been a huge success story. I want to do the same thing.
Not fast enough, but
not fast enough. But the costs now are clearly scalable.
Yes.
So I want to take the $50 billion that we provide in direct subsidies to fossil fuel companies, because that's the number, $50 billion. That's not total subsidies, that's just direct that only those companies get. $50 billion, and I want to use that to create a market for direct air capture, meaning the government buys CO2 from firms, if you will, that can capture it, which, by the way, could include farmers who change how they plant their crops, right? So you can do it, you could have agricultural methods to capture CO2, or you can build machines. To me, it doesn't matter. We're going to create a market so that you actually have an incentive to do it. What that will do is it'll suddenly encourage people to innovate and invest and figure out how we take these proven technologies, because they are proven. The IPCC report acknowledged that these technologies exist and they work. That's how we scale them up. And I don't think we can take a chance. I mean, I don't want to take a chance on the next generation that we're going to get to net zero by 2050 without doing this. So what I want to do as part of my multi-point climate strategy is to have this huge effort around building these technologies so that if we come up short, we actually can start removing the CO2. Because we can't be sitting around in 2045 and say to ourselves, we're not going to get there. Oh my gosh, what do we do?
Right. I mean, the fear, of course, is that people bank on, carbon sequestration technology has been a little bit of a boondoggle. It's been something that the coal industry has often sold as clean coal, like we're going to burn the coal and then we're going to suck it out of the air.
Right.
Has proved to be a
doesn't work.
A colossal disaster.
I'm talking about something totally different, right? That is what's called kind of on-site capture.
Yep.
And I'm not for that.
Right.
What I'm for, this is kind of my vision. So I want to lay a new pipeline in the Midwest, but it's not a fossil fuel pipeline. It's a CO2 pipeline. It's called the CO2 Expressway. And we're going to lay it next to existing natural gas right-of-ways. And what that will do is create an incentive for people to invest in direct air capture technologies in the heartland of the United States of America, which is where we need jobs. So I'm talking about something entirely different.
Right.
I'm not in favor of kind of on-site capture. I'm in favor of direct air capture.
This is maybe a dumb question.
But this doesn't solve the problem. This is like an insurance
policy.
I
know. But just to follow me down the road, like where does the carbon go once it goes down the highway?
Well, you can store it actually in big cavities in the ground.
Yeah.
And there are commercial applications that people are increasingly coming up with. And if there was actually a fair amount of it, they would come up with more.
Right.
We just have to get to net zero by 2050. And I just don't think we can take any chance with that goal.
And so another part of your plan that is different than others, and I didn't get to talk about the Senator Sanders or Senator Bennett, but is nuclear. And there's two sort of issues around nuclear. There's existing plants that are in operation. Yes. The most recent one they tried to expand in Georgia was a bit of a
disaster.
Total disaster. Yeah. And then there's new plants.
Yes.
You favor both keeping existing plants going and building new plants. Why the latter?
Well, I do favor keeping existing plants because I don't think you can be serious about climate and against existing nuclear capacity. Right? It's roughly 10% of the energy, and it's fantastic baseload energy, which you need.
It's not variable.
That's right, and that's incredibly important because the sun doesn't shine all the time, the wind doesn't blow all the time, and right now a lot of our baseload fuels are fossil fuels, coal, things like that. And nuclear provides a great baseload fuel because we get the energy all the time.
We should say that the idea of battery technology is that you smooth out that variability and you get to the point where you don't have to worry that way.
Which is why I've called for a 5-fold increase in the Department of Energy research budget. Literally a moonshot around basic research and battery technology. Right now we spend $6 billion a year at the Department of Energy. I want that to be $30 billion. So over 10 years, that's taking it from 60 to 300 billion, exactly to get that battery technology. But as it relates to nuclear, what I want to do is invest in advanced nuclear, which is smaller, more stable reactors. I think we're about 2 decades away from having those be actually things we can use. But again, if we wait 10 years to invest in them, then they're 2 decades away from that. As you can tell, I want to be attacking this from all angles. And the other part of my plan, which is unique, is it's a very big bet on American innovation. Because if we're going to solve this issue globally, we fundamentally have to build the advanced energy economy with new battery, new transmissions, new nuclear, direct air capture. These are things that I believe we can invent, we can scale, and we can deliver not only here but around the world to solve. It's the only way we're going to get the rest of the world, because they're fundamentally not going to deny their citizens energy.
You also have a fee and dividend.
Yes, that's the cornerstone of my plan.
That's the cornerstone. And it's been interesting. I've been covering climate policy for, I guess, probably like 12 years at this point. And there's been an interesting arc in either carbon taxes, cap and trade fee and dividend, any of those regimes, which are sort of a little out of fashion in policy circles right now. What's your logic for it, and what do you think about the political aspects of it?
So I think the political aspects of it are really pretty clear, and the reason I believe that is I introduced that legislation in the Congress. It was my bill, and it was bipartisan. In other words, I had Republicans on a proposal to put a price on carbon. And this bill was modeled to cut CO2 emissions by 90% by 2050. So it really will work, I believe, and I believe you can get it done. Now, what's different about my proposal is I don't take the money and spend it on a bunch of government projects, many of which I would totally support, but you can't get that done politically. What I do is I take all the money and give it back to the American people in a dividend. So it goes out one pocket, in the other, but meanwhile, we make fossil fuels so much more expensive that they get discouraged, people start investing in renewables, people start changing behavior. And I think it's the thing I can do in my first year as president. And the reason I know that is because I was able to get it done on a bipartisan basis. And I think the coalition to get this done is obvious. It's all the Democrats in the Congress, and it's Republicans who live in coastal states.
You think that there's, what, 10 Republican votes in the United States Senate from coastal states for a carbon fee and dividend?
This is what I think. The area of this country that is going to be most negatively affected in many ways by climate change is the Southeast.
Yes, correct.
And there are 6 states that comprise the Southeast, the way I'm thinking about it, and all 6 of them have 2 Republican senators. So that's 12 potential votes in the Senate to do a carbon fee and dividend. And the Republicans who are on my bill were from Florida, right? Marco Rubio and Rick Scott, they will not get reelected, in my opinion, as senators of Florida unless they do something on climate change.
You think that's true? You think the politics have changed that much?
In Florida.
Rick Scott just got elected the first time, just a year ago.
I said reelected. No, it's changing. If you look at the polling in Florida, obviously Democrats, independents overwhelmingly support action, but a majority of registered Republicans in the state of Florida believe climate change is happening, human behavior is contributing to it, and the federal government should do something about it.
Do you think the mechanism? I mean, one of the big critiques of carbon prices is that what ends up happening is unless the price is sufficiently high, you're just not getting the forcing mechanism you need. And
That's why you got to get it high.
well, and this is why what you end up happening is you get big oil companies actually being like, yeah, tax carbon, yeah, do your thing, knock yourself out. And then they'll go in there and try to lobby to keep that price at essentially a level that they can swallow.
Well, you got to do it right. I mean, you can have a carbon fee that doesn't work.
Yes.
You can put $1 a metric ton and it's not going to do anything. Right. People shrug their shoulders and move on. I mean, my bill puts $15 a metric ton, but it grows $15 a year. So it's a very fast escalator across 10 years. And it effectively puts $3 trillion of fees on CO2. And all that money gets dividended back, which makes it progressive because your average American will get a dividend bigger than their energy costs go up. So listen, do I think a carbon fee and dividend is all we have to do? Absolutely not. But what I think is different about my proposals is having come from the private sector, having started businesses, created thousands of jobs, understand the innovation economy, I believe a combination of things, a carbon fee and dividend, which will start changing behavior pretty dramatically, massive investment in basic research to come up with new battery technologies, starting a moonshot around direct air capture, continuing and expanding the renewable tax credits, creating Paris 2.0, which is a global consortium around innovation, and then as part of my national service program, having a climate corps to get young people engaged going around this country. I think that approach will allow us to get to net zero by 2050, and it won't put the pain on hardworking Americans. Well, and that's key to the politics of this.
Well, but what's interesting about this is this sort of policy profile has government steering much more than rowing. That it's more that you want to sort of use government for basic research and correct market signals to drive innovation, right?
Yeah.
And I think the critique of that supporters of, say, the Green New Deal, who are looking at a much more publicly managed undertaking, is that the tendency of that is that it screws over frontline communities, that the benefits accrue to the people who are already getting benefits in this economy, that the damages accrue to the people who are already being damaged and marginalized in this economy. What do you say to them that say these market signals might work, but they also might have the effect of exacerbating existing inequality?
So you got to correct for those things, right? You actually have to put your thumb on the scale. So when you structure your carbon fee and dividend, you have to make sure the dividend is progressive so that low-income Americans get disproportionately more of the money. So they walk away ahead of the game. The second thing you got to do, because part of my plan is also a $2 trillion national infrastructure program.
Right.
Part of that is massive investments in communities that are struggling and left behind. Right? So that's the part of my plan that is in many ways central planning in its orientation,
right,
which is taking $2 trillion of federal infrastructure dollars and making sure those dollars are invested in the communities that are on the front line, that have been burdened with polluters. Because we know what's happened over the last several decades. Polluting entities have been set up in low-income communities because those residents haven't been able to wage the political fights to stop them. So we have to not only tax those polluters and penalize them for what they did and make sure they clean it up, but we have to go into those communities and we have to replace those also employers, by the way, in many of these communities with other economic drivers. So that's how I do use market forces a lot. It is a huge bet on innovation. It's a much more global plan because trade is part of it. One of the reasons I was for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because I'm like, how does the United States of America actually not change global behavior unless we have economic relations with our allies around the world? So it's very global, it's very innovation-oriented, it's very market-oriented, but it does have some old-fashioned central planning aspects to it in terms of how infrastructure dollars are invested in these communities. And I'm so optimistic that this kind of an approach can get us there, but in part because I think I can get this stuff done. Because the question people should be asking is not what is your plan, are you going to get it done? Because we're literally running out of time on this issue. It's not like other issues. We've got a huge problem with public education in this country. We've got to fix it. It's immoral the way we fund public education. But if we don't deal with it for 5 years, it doesn't get exponentially worse. Right. It's still a terrible situation. But if we don't deal with this, we start digging ourselves a hole that we literally can't get out of.
So then my question to you is climate change to you the problem or a problem?
If you believe, as I do, that our responsibility as people who have the privilege to be involved in public service, if you believe that our fundamental responsibility is to leave the world better than we found it, for my kids, for your kids, for all these young people, and then the next generation, if you believe that that is your responsibility, which I do, that's why I ran for office, then this has to be your top priority. Because this is the area where we are not, definitively not leaving the world. Because other aspects of the world are actually getting a lot better. You know, the global poverty rate goes down every day. We have innovations that are extending life expectancy, taking diseases that used to be terminal and turning them chronic. We live in a world where there's so many things that are actually getting better every single day, except for one that's getting so much worse, and it's this issue. So this has to be your top priority. Very simply, what's our job? Leave the world better than you found it. If you want to do that, you have to deal with climate.
In terms of the international dimensions, how do you see climate diplomacy working? Bernie Sanders was just talking about the possibility of sanctions on sort of bad actors.
Yes.
On carbon. You can see a world in which obviously the reason that Paris which was an incredible diplomatic achievement,
yes,
for all its shortcomings, was that every country declared there's a sort of public transparency, but no one else was going to enforce on anyone else, right? Is that strong enough to get us to where we need to be? And if not, what are the tools you can use to make sure that China, India, others are not sort of eating up whatever reductions we have?
So Paris, listen, I'll sign us back into Paris before I sit down in the chair in the Oval Office. But we got to do so much more than Paris. So clearly it's not enough. But this is why I think trade is really important, because our current president is an isolationist. Many of the people I'm running against on the Democratic Party basically have the same economic view. Economic isolationism. Trade agreements are bad. You fundamentally cannot deal with climate change if that is your approach. You can't deal with migration. You can't deal with global pandemics. You can't deal with the fact that social media is putting many countries in a position where they can't even control their own borders. You can't deal with any of those issues unless you engage globally. And the best way to engage globally is economically, to build economic ties. So that's how I think about how you approach this issue. We have to get back to the old-fashioned US business of having alliances and getting all of our allies on the same page. But then we have to deliver positive solutions to people, right? We're not just going to be able to put tariffs on people to deal with this, because look, that's not really working right now, and we see a living, breathing example of that, and it's not working. This is what I'm calling for with Paris 2, which is very unique, is that the leading countries of the world get together and say, we're going to contribute technology, we're going to contribute money, this is where the wealthy countries come in, money, and we're going to contribute intellectual capital. And we are going to build the energy solutions that are needed for the developing world.
And it would be like,
and the U.S. has to lead in that.
Essentially like a kind of creative commons for the technology? That
yes,
you could
it's
then
like think of it like a common platform. No one owns it, the world owns it.
Right. Be interesting.
And by the way, as part of that is incentive and financing mechanisms. Think of like a new World Bank. So when you actually come up with these things, because this is the issue that I think people don't analyze as starkly as we need to. When you're running a country, and it's a developing country, and a huge amount of your population is going from abject poverty to some form of non-abject poverty, which is fantastic. That's progress. They need more energy.
Yeah.
And those countries will not deny them energy because of climate change. They won't, because that's not how politics works. So we have to deliver them. We don't want them to replicate our energy strategy. We want them to think of it like cell phone. You know, none of them have landlines. They basically jumped ahead and went right to mobile. That's how we have to think about this. And unless the United States is clear-eyed about that, and only the United States can do this. I think doing what I just described, it will be the most important, in many ways, foreign policy initiative I launch as president. Because that's the kind of leadership we need if we want to solve this problem. Because, you know, most of the poor people in the world live at or below sea level. In Bangladesh alone, 20 million people are estimated to be displaced from their homes by 2040 because of climate. That's twice the number of people who are displaced from their homes in Syria. And we saw how destabilizing that was.
Yep.
So I just think that's how you have to think about it globally. You can't tariff your way to solving climate change globally. You have to innovate, because it's not even about China. It's about all these other countries.
Right. I think we're going to go to some students.
Sorry to go into so much there, but I really feel strongly about this issue.
Let's go to the first student at the University of New Hampshire.
Can I go? Hello, my name's Nick Crosby. I'm a junior from, I'm a Just Studies and Political Science major, and my question is, what have you done during your years in Congress to combat climate change, and what differs you from all of the other presidential candidates?
So I'm not sure I heard the audio perfectly. What did I do in Congress to deal with climate, and was there a second part to the question?
How do you distinguish yourself from all the other
Got
candidates?
it. So I think I can answer the two questions together in some ways. I think what I did to most distinguish myself from everyone else is I actually introduced legislation that had bipartisan support. And if we ever want to get something done big on climate, it's going to have to be done in the Congress of the United States by passing laws. And the best way to pass big transformative laws is to get bipartisan support. So I introduced the only bipartisan bill on climate. It was a carbon fee and dividend, which Chris and I just talked about. And it had Democrats and Republicans in equal number. And I think it's a template for what I'll do as president in my first year. So that was in many ways the biggest thing I did in Congress on climate, because this was a huge initiative. I worked very closely with a lot of the Environmental Defense Fund, Citizens Climate Lobby, and was able to get it done on a bipartisan basis. The other area I was a leader was I was one of the first members of Congress to come out against the Keystone Pipeline. And I was very active and vocal on that issue, and actually organized a lot of events on the Hill for my colleagues to talk about how why we shouldn't be doing this. Because it wasn't obvious to a lot of people initially that this was a bad thing to do. And so I had a lot of leadership on those issues. So those were probably the two issues that I led the most on. And I think what differentiates me from my colleagues is I didn't just talk about this stuff. I put forth a real solution, and it got introduced on a bipartisan basis. So if you think about who's got the best chance of getting any of this done that all the candidates talk about, I think the person who actually showed that they can build that kind of coalition, I think that's what differentiates me. I'll see you up in New Hampshire.
Let me follow up
Sure.
on that legislation. So, but that didn't get a vote.
Didn't get a vote, but I got Republicans on a carbon fee, which, by the way, is also known as a carbon tax.
Right. How many?
Well, we introduced it 3 and 3.
3 and 3. I mean, that is impressive, but it's so far from the reality of the political system, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the point is the leadership, and again, this applies to every single person who says this and every single person who's dealing with the problem, so
Yes.
I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but it is the case that John Boehner, of course, never would bring that to the floor, in the same way that Mitch McConnell will never bring a piece of climate legislation to the floor unless he thinks he can kill it and make a point.
Right, so that's why we have to win the House and the Senate. But even when we win the House and the Senate, we've got to put forth things that can get broad support. Because, look,
and you think fee and dividend, you think of all the policies, you think fee and dividend is the one policy that you could conceivably get Republicans on.
Well, if you were to ask the question slightly differently, the one big thing.
Right.
There's a lot of small ball stuff you can do.
Yeah, and mitigation stuff. I mean,
absolutely.
They're going to start pouring money into mitigation that we've never seen.
But in terms of big,
yeah,
because it is big, you put a fee on carbon, which raises $3 trillion over 10 years, you're totally going to change how energy. Every single enterprise in the United States of America after this bill is passed will sit down in whatever their boards, whatever the case may be, and they'll say, okay, this is what the future cost of CO2 is going to be, or carbon is going to be. How are we repositioning how we use energy based on that? Right. They'll change how they invest money. They'll change every single decision they make. And I know in my heart that I can get this done, and I know the coalition. It is every single Democrat, which won't be easy, by the way.
No.
I mean, we have some Democrats in states that this is tough. And the Republicans in those North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Louisiana, and Texas. The political reality for those 12 Republican senators is such that they have to do something on this issue. And this is the thing they'll do. Because even all the anti-tax people, You know, all those people who make people sign pledges and they don't view this as a tax increase because they say, yeah, you're putting a tax on carbon, but you're giving the money right back to the American people, so it's tax neutral.
Hey, Congressman Delaney.
Hey.
I'm Luke Rappaport from the McCourt School of Public Policy. I actually happened to see you earlier today.
Yes.
Thanks for coming by. So my question for you is, your plan calls for the building of a vast new set of pipelines across the country. So given the capital-intensive nature of pipelines, many who have studied this issue believe that that would actually lock in future oil and gas exploration. How is this consistent with decarbonization by 2050?
I'm not calling for any new fossil fuel pipelines at all. Absolutely not.
But a set of pipelines that could transfer carbon.
Yes. Carbon throughway. Something totally different. Right? What I'm calling for is no new fossil fuel pipelines. I just want to be, I was one of the first people in Congress to stand up against the Keystone pipeline. But if we're actually going to capture CO2, which directly from the atmosphere, not on site, directly from the atmosphere, which I believe we're going to have to do to get to net zero by 2050, we have to create a mechanism for that CO2 to be transported and safely stored or utilized. I would also like that new industry to be located in the heartland of the United States of America, where we need jobs. So by creating the carbon throughway, which cannot carry fossil fuels, it is built to carry captured CO2, and laying that pipeline in existing natural gas right-of-ways. So there's no new right-of-ways. We're not going to go in any lands that, tribal or otherwise, it's just going to be in existing right-of-ways. I will then lay the groundwork for this whole new industry to be built in the heartland, which is, just imagine, just like when you drive in the heartland and you see these windmills, which I actually think are beautiful, the wind turbines, how they juxtapose against the rural landscape. Imagine in the future, if you can, this amazing technology that is working side by side with agricultural methods to capture CO2, where we're actually removing CO2 directly from the atmosphere. And that's what the carbon throughway, you can't build that industry unless you have a way to transport the CO2 once you capture it.
I think we're going to go next to USC.
Great. USC's pumped up.
They are.
Hello, Congressman. My name is TJ York. I'm a junior here at USC studying human biology. I was wondering, how specifically do you plan to make carbon taxes affordable for working class Americans living in areas with little access to green resources?
Thanks, TJ, for the question. So the way the carbon fee, I like to call it a carbon fee, for obvious reasons, but let's face it, it is putting a tax on carbon. The way it works is you put a fee or a tax on the CO2, and all that money gets collected by the federal government, and it gets put in a lockbox. So it can't be used for anything else. And it's a lot of money. It's $3 trillion over 10 years. It's a huge amount of money. And then what happens is every year the American people get a dividend from that lockbox. And it's structured to be basically an equal dividend. And if you look at how energy is utilized, what you'd realize is that working, hardworking middle class and lower income Americans, the amount that their energy prices will go up or their energy costs will go up because of the carbon fee is less than the amount of the dividend they'll get. So let's say their energy costs go up about $600, $700. In the early years, their fee will be like $1,500. So that on its face, I can look any American in the face, any hardworking American in the face, and I can say, listen, you're going to get more from the dividend than you do in your increased energy costs. So I'm not trying to solve climate change on your back. And it's really important because right now in our country, and this is a terrible statistic, DJ, but 40% of our citizens can't afford their basic necessities. They can't afford their housing, their food, or their utilities. So it's very hard for us to come up with a solution that actually raises their energy costs without any compensation to offset it. And that's why I think this structure is so important. A lot of people try carbon fees, like Washington State, which is actually a very progressive state. They tried for years to pass a carbon tax. But all the money was going into the government, and they were going to use it on green energy projects, which are probably things that you and I support. But to your average taxpayer in the state of Washington, they were like, you're going to raise my energy prices to build some things that I don't even know what you're going to do with it. And they voted it down. So that's why the politics of this is really important. And also as part of an infrastructure plan, like I was talking to Chris about, which I've got a $2 trillion national infrastructure plan with a lot of allocation towards sustainability and building weather-resistant infrastructure and preparing communities. There's a disproportionate allocation in my plan for communities that are struggling economically. And then I got a whole plan to help communities that are struggling economically in general. I think 25% of our government contractors should be required to have half their employees in struggling communities, things like that. But that's how I'd address that worker issue, TJ.
Let me follow up
Sure.
on the math of it. So, first of all, who's collecting at what point the carbon tax? Who's paying it?
So it's paid kind of at the point that it's put onto the system. So it's not necessarily paid at the gas station, it's paid at the producer level.
Okay, and then
The federal government collects it.
Right.
It gets
at
basically
the producer level.
Yes.
And that cost gets passed along to consumers, and because of the distribution of income and the distribution
Yes.
of energy consumption, you're saying that an average household will get, say, a net $700 increase.
Yes. I mean, it changes over time, right? Because it actually, the fee goes up and the dividend goes up. But basically, that's the way the math works because, higher income people use a lot more energy.
Yep.
And their dividend is going to be the exact same dividend.
So every household gets
everyone gets the same dividend. So if you're a high earner and you have 4 cars and you haven't moved to electric cars or any of that stuff yet, your energy is going up a lot and your dividend is going to be a lot less than that.
Right.
But if you're your average hardworking American, your energy costs are not going to go up as much as your dividend. And I'm structured.
Is that the way it works in Alaska on the dividend? Is it the same for everyone in Alaska?
Yeah, I think so. The other thing I have is the dividend can be paid a couple of different ways. It can be paid in cash, but it also can be put into a retirement savings account, a college savings account, or a health savings account. Because these programs, which some in the audience are probably familiar with, we're probably more familiar with it because as you get more involved in the workforce, you start focusing on these things more. There's these amazing programs that allow people to defer income for retirement, for education, or for healthcare tax-free. They're great programs. The problem is most Americans don't use them because they don't have the discretionary money.
They don't have the money for it.
I think it would be cool to give people the option.
Yeah.
And I'm playing around with an idea to create an incentive that maybe your dividend is 110% of what it would be if you took it in one of those savings accounts to actually get those people getting advantages of those programs. I also am going to pay the dividend up front. And this is to help get the thing passed because we know exactly how much this will raise. So if you pay the dividend to the average American up front and then collect the fee across the year from a government accounting purpose, it works out the same.
Right.
So I can get this, I believe in my heart and soul, I can get this past my first year as president. Hi.
Good afternoon, Congressman Delaney. My name is Michelle Vasquez, and I'm a political science and business major at Trinity Washington University. And this afternoon, I would like to ask you about U.S. corporations and businesses. Should corporations have to invest more in energy efficiency technologies, and how will your administration support small businesses in combating climate change?
Great. Michelle, right?
Yes.
So the answer is yes. I want to make sure one of the benefits of putting a price on carbon is you create a real incentive for every business in the United States of America to sit down immediately and say to themselves, how do I make myself more energy efficient? Which they should have incentives to do already, by the way. But more importantly, how do we make sure the energy that we consume comes from renewables and not from fossil fuels? Because they're going to sit down in all their various meeting rooms and they're going to say to themselves, if we keep getting our energy from fossil fuels, it's going to go up a lot every year. And so now is the time for us to invest in making the switch. And individuals will do it. They'll make different choices about the cars they buy. They'll make different choices about the energy systems they put in their home. And businesses will make fundamentally different choices about how they source their energy. So that's the business. And then as it relates to small businesses, I was an entrepreneur. I started 2 companies, took them both public, created thousands of jobs. And so I'm very focused on the entrepreneur economy. And you can tell by my proposal, it's a lot about innovation and investing in things. I think if we get the policy right, we're going to unleash small businesses like we've never seen. Because all of these incentives I'm talking about, five-fold increase in Department of Energy research, building the carbon throughway, creating the direct air technology, direct air capture technology industry, doing this Paris 2.0, which is this global consortium, all of these things are just perfect for entrepreneurs. You know, and entrepreneurs like me start businesses, grow them, but they need a market opportunity, and that's what I think I can do uniquely, Michelle. So thank you for the question.
Let me follow up on,
Sure.
on something that's in the news right now, which is the president's standoff with California on fuel efficiency standards.
First time in 100 years, I think, right?
Yeah. My sense is that you would take the reverse actions.
Of course, yeah.
Right.
I mean, there are certain things you do before you sit down in the chair in the Oval Office. Paris, dumb things like that, a whole bunch of methane, you know, rolling back the methane, right? I mean, it's crazy.
But then the question is, what is your other conception of what executive powers are available to you if, in fact, Mitch McConnell says
Yes.
that John Delaney's bipartisanship is not working?
Not happening right now.
Not working for him.
So I would use every single executive authority I could possibly muster, including considering a national emergency, to get this done. You asked earlier how important I think this is. That's how important I think it is. I don't think you do that. Certain things you do by executive action your first day. Paris, methane, California, 200 other things. Most of them, by the way, are reversing things that Trump overturned.
Right.
I don't think you go right to national emergency, because if you do that, you're done with the Congress. So I think what you have to do is you have to try, because the only way you make enduring change is to pass laws. We have to pass laws. And so initially, I'm going to work incredibly hard with the Congress. I was ranked the third most bipartisan member in Congress, so I think I know how to do this. And I'm going to get laws passed in the Congress. But there is nothing I won't consider, you know, that's legal and within the power of the presidency to actually make a difference on this issue.
All right. Question here.
Hi, my name is Caitlin McGill. I am studying environmental science and technology at the University of Maryland. And I am a Native American from the Warm Springs Confederated Tribes, and natural resources and fisheries are being depleted on the reservation, which impacts our culture and way of life. Have you thought about this aspect of climate change, and do you have a plan that serves Native communities?
Michelle, right?
Oh, I'm Caitlin.
Caitlin, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
Caitlin. I apologize, Caitlin. Yes, I have thought about it, and I've spent a lot of time talking to Native American communities and tribes about issues that they care about. This is obviously a very important issue for the communities because of the effect that they're seeing, just like every American is seeing in their own communities. They also see how they've been particularly vulnerable, as have a lot of frontline and disadvantaged communities have been to this issue because they've been exposed to more pollution. They haven't had the kind of healthcare system that they deserve. They haven't had the kind of environmental protections. There's been people that have basically not respected their sovereignty and wanted to run pipelines through their lands. So as president, I will respect the sovereignty. I will ensure that decisions affecting the lands are made by the tribes and the nations. And I will make sure that Native American communities are treated not only with dignity and respect, but that they have the resources to actually deal with the effect this is going to have on them, including public health, because there's a huge public health crisis going on, as you know. So thank you, Caitlin.
Next question.
Hello, Congressman. Thank
Hi.
you for coming today. My name's Emily. I'm a sophomore here at Georgetown studying international politics. And my question relates to, in Appalachia, many areas have been dependent on coal and other extractive industries to drive the economy. And some of these individuals feel green initiatives have left them behind or left them out of the discussion entirely. What does your environmental program do to revitalize and sustain these communities?
So it's an incredibly important question. And I represented Western Maryland in the Congress of the United States. And Western Maryland has a coal legacy. And the one thing that I think people don't realize is when you go to towns that have had a lot of employment related to the coal industry, you always see typically two monuments in the town square. The first monument is a tribute to the people who lost their lives defending our nation. You see that in most towns. But there's often another monument where there's a tribute to the fact that that town contributed the energy to the Allied forces that saved the world. And so the legacy and the pride that a lot of these communities have in the contributions they've made to help build this country and in many ways save the world is significant. And it's not captured by just talking about the current number of jobs in the industry. It's a much broader kind of identity that these communities are rightly proud of. And we have to realize people who work in the coal industry, for example, the human beings who actually work in the industry. My dad was a union electrician. I'm the first in my family to go to college, so I grew up in a working class family. These people didn't do anything wrong. In fact, they did everything precisely right. They got a good job, they worked hard, and they supported their family. So when we do something as a nation that is the right thing to do, which is to put ourselves in a position, which I believe we can do, that we have net zero emissions by 2050, and we make all the dramatic changes I just talked about, we have an absolute obligation to those individuals and those communities to make sure they have economic opportunity. Because a lot of people, when they talk about climate change, the opposition will often bring a coal miner on stage, often holding their hands of their little child. And they'll look at them and they'll say, you want to take away my job and put me in a position not to support my family. My proposals, which, by the way, I don't want to announce in Washington, D.C., I want to announce them in these communities. I want to look at that family and say what I'm doing is actually, in my opinion, a great day for you. Because not only will your children live in a world that's sustainable, but we're going to make sure your community has jobs and you have jobs and you're taken care of. So I think we have to take care of the workers, and we need real programs to invest in these communities, which include creating incentives for private companies to invest. One of the things I referenced quickly before is I want to pass a law that says 25% of government contracts have to go to firms that have half of their employees in distressed communities. I want to create real incentives, both hard government investments and incentives for private companies to invest in these communities so they have the economic lift they deserve. Thank you, Emil. Hey.
Hi, Congressman. Thank you for taking my question. My name is Luke Henkel. I am, sorry.
That's all right.
Kind of caught a bug. But I'm from Indianapolis, and I'm a freshman in the college here at Georgetown. So a lot of your campaign is focused around pragmatic solutions that have a good chance of political success. So what specifically is your proposal to get all your climate plans through Congress, and with what time frame?
Well, it's a good question, Luke, because in many ways it's the most important question, as we were talking about earlier. What matters, what you all should be asking us is not just what we're going to do, but how and when are you going to get it done? Because the last thing we want to have happen is in 2028, right, when that presidential election cycle going on, we don't want to be talking about this stuff in the same situation we're in today, it just being worse. We want to talk about all that we've done and the more stuff we're going to do. So the first thing, as I said to Chris, I want to do is pass my carbon fee and dividend. Huge, transformative, will change everything. Second thing I want to do is ramp up the basic research. And again, historically, basic research has been pretty bipartisan. And the reason for that is it's the best investment the government makes. If you look back over decades of data, for every dollar we spend on basic research, we get $2.50 of economic growth. That's a pretty good investment. And I think I can get bipartisan support to increase basic research right away. The other thing, as the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief, and the person principally responsible for U.S. foreign policy, I want to create this Paris 2.0 framework, which is around innovation. So Paris 1.0, we're back in, we got our goals, it's all set. Paris 2.0, we're getting all the developed countries around a table saying, you can almost imagine this like it was a movie, right? And they were trying to deal with this catastrophe. What do we all do? What do we do dollar-wise? What do we do innovation-wise? What do we do people-wise? How do we create a global community of innovation to come up with the advanced energy solutions that we know the world needs? Because the thing you got to remember is 80% of the energy in the world, 80% of it comes from fossil fuels right now. That is the scale of this challenge. You know, we have to replace it. Only 10% is renewables, and about 10% is nuclear. So we got a lot of innovation to do. So those are things, and I think I get those done, Luke. I really do.
Hello, Congressman Delaney. My name is Jared Williams, and I'm an environmental sciences and policy student at the University of Maryland. And my question to you is, part of your proposed climate action plan is the construction of a carbon throughway to transfer captured carbon for commercial uses. What would you say to critics who argue that the carbon throughway is environmentally destructive due to the construction of a national array of pipelines? And additionally, do you think that it's jumping the gun in the absence of a marketable carbon capture technology?
So let me tell you how I think about that. First of all, it can only transport carbon, so it won't transport any fossil fuel. Secondly, it'll be laid in existing right-of-ways, right? So it'll basically be laid next to all the natural gas pipelines that exist already in this country. So all of these various fights that we've had about, you know, the Keystone and various other pipelines that were going through environmentally sensitive lands or lands that had previously been undisturbed or tribal lands, none of that will exist. There's existing natural gas pipelines in the ground all over this country. You could look at the map. This will be laid right on top of them. So no new things. The other thing, since I don't want to build fossil fuel pipelines, as I said earlier, there are a lot of people who actually build fossil fuel pipelines for a living in this country. There are a lot of workers, again, people like my dad, the electrician, laborers, masons. This is what they do for a living. I think it's pretty cool to be able to say, you're going to continue to work on stuff. It's just going to be the pipeline of the future, not the pipeline of the past. So I actually think that's very good, not only policy, but I think it's very good politics. Because all those, trust me, I had a hard time with this, because I was one of the first people to come out against the Keystone. And lined up outside my office were union laborers, union electricians. My dad's union, the IBEW, paid for me to go to college. They gave me a scholarship that paid for half of my tuition. These people are coming into my office saying, why are you opposing something that's going to put people like your dad to work? These were tough conversations. And so I want to sit there and say, I want to lean right back into them and say, you're going to go to work, you're just going to build the stuff of the future. So that's really important. But this is the other thing. We have to get to net zero by 2050. I believe as president I can do that. I'm not willing to take a risk on your future and your kids' future that we're not going to get there. And so if we're sitting here in 2045 and we still have a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere because we haven't figured out, because remember, even if we get the electric grid to net zero, which we absolutely can, even if we get every car out there electric, we still have airplanes, big ships, manufacturing, and farming that actually produces CO2. So until we figure out how we get those things to net zero, we're going to have to offset. I don't want to be offsetting forever, but I don't want to stake your future and your kids' future and wait too long to build in the contingency that we may actually have to extract CO2. And look, this is where the global issue, because there's no country in the world that's in a better position, no big country in the world that's in a better position to get to net zero than the United States of America. It's going to be very hard for a lot of other countries. Yeah. And we need these solutions.
All right. I think we'll take the final question right here.
Hi, my name is Sage Johnson. I'm a freshman at Trinity Washington University. I'm studying political science and international affairs. So you talked about reducing carbon emissions in the atmosphere by 20% through the process of carbon scrubbing and storing carbon in the ground. However, this process poses a few issues, including the enormous amount of energy it uses and the cost that it will incur. Have you considered other natural and cheaper ways to reduce carbon levels in our atmosphere, such as creating and preserving forests, wetlands, and grasslands?
Absolutely. The one point I want to, what was your name again, sorry?
Sage.
Sage. Sage, the one point I want to convey to you is that I view this issue as so serious that we have to do everything. It's okay to risk overcorrecting on this. You know the concept of overcorrecting? You know, you go a little too far. We can take that risk on this issue. So we may not need to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. We may not need to do it. I hope we don't need to do it. But we may. And I just want to be ready for it. All of that stuff I've actually taken into consideration, because anything you do building electric cars produces CO2 in the atmosphere. Right? Everything is a net calculus, which is how much CO2 do you produce to do something and how much do you save by doing it. The market that I want to create for capturing CO2, that same market is going to be available to farmers, where we can actually create financial incentives for them to change their agricultural practices. When we were talking earlier about trade, I was saying one of the things I want to do as president is kind of stabilize trade around agriculture, so that we can actually be using the world's land as efficiently as possible to feed all the human beings of the world. I want the ratio of trees to farmland to go up over time, as opposed to what it's been doing going down. And that's why we've got to encourage these sustainable farming practices. And you go to places like Iowa, you see some real cutting-edge stuff. But I really believe, and this is the one message I want to make sure, Sage, you get and everyone gets here, we can do this. But the only way we're going to do this is we have to do it together. Right? John F. Kennedy gave a great speech in 1958 where he said we shouldn't seek the Republican answer, we shouldn't seek the Democratic answer, we should seek the right answer. To solve the climate crisis, there are right answers. Discouraging the use of CO2, innovating our way out of the problem, building a global community, changing agricultural practices, and putting ourselves in a position, think of it like break glass in an emergency, putting ourselves in a position that in an emergency, we can break glass and start removing CO2 from the atmosphere. That's what my plan is about, because I want to solve this problem, and I know we can do it.
All right.
Thank you, Sage.
Congressman John Delaney, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Give him a hand.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Ali Velshi will be out here with Tim Ryan in 15 minutes. See you then.